We noted in our previous video that I will link in the description below on theories of religion and secularization, that the secularization thesis posits that as industrialization, urbanization, and rationalization increase, religiousness will decrease. But also, as we noted in our previous video, is that the secularization thesis has not been without its critics. Arguably, an influential critique has been offered by the sociologist of religion, Rodney Stark. Stark has brought into question many of the assumptions and claims proposed by proponents of the secularization thesis. Stark seems to oppose both the moderate and extreme versions of secularization. As we noted, the extreme version, in contrast to the moderate version, claims that religion itself will one day disappear. We looked at several theorists like Auguste Comte who held to this line of thought. Usually, proponents of the extreme version view science as having the most damaging impact on religion. Science, according to their logic, is what will free humanity from the superstitions of religion. The moderate version, moreover, simply predicts religion's decline as society modernizes and progresses rationally. In Stark's essay, Secularization, R.I.P., published in 1999, he critiques both these views. Importantly, Stark does not deny the obvious fact that religion has in areas lost the power that it once had. As he writes, quote, "Everyone must agree that, in contemporary Europe, for example, Catholic bishops have less political power than they once possessed, and the same is true of Lutheran and Anglican bishops. Nor are primary aspects of public life any longer suffused with religious symbols, rhetoric, or ritual." Stark locates the extreme version of secularization in the 17th century, traces it back to the 17th century when British thinkers first presented militant attacks on religious faith. He notes Thomas Woolston, who predicted that modernity would trump faith and that Christianity would be gone by the year 1900. There is, of course, philosopher Auguste Comte, who predicted that society would outgrow the earlier theological and metaphysical stages to eventually embrace what he termed the positive scientific stage. Another theorist by the name A.E. Crawley claimed that religion's extension is only a matter of time. And Anthony Wallace posited that the evolutionary future of religion is extinction. Stark, however, argues that these views are too extreme and are undermined by the facts. In fact, most sociologists of religion would agree with Stark on this point, that the extreme version of secularization lacks any strong evidential support. Now, returning to Stark's major contentions, in his essay he presents 8 of them. Number 1, no fewer Western people today attend church than was the case during the Middle Ages. Number 2, religious belief is no less prevalent in the contemporary West than was the case during the Middle Ages. Stark refers to this as the myth of religious decline. Number 3, the piety of historical Western European societies has been greatly exaggerated, which renders it objectionable as a point of comparison to the religiosity of modern Western European societies. He refers to this as the myth of past piety. Number 4, the christianization of parts of Europe has been exaggerated and was not nearly as omnipresent as commonly assumed. Thus, Stark caused the failure to christianize. 5th, so-called secular countries are not in fact secular, given the evidence of their internal religiosity. 6th, scientists are no more irreligious today than they have been over the past century. 7th, religion has experienced a significant revival in countries where atheism and secularism were previously forced on the population through violent and coercive state means. And finally, secularization is mistakenly universalized, which is disproven by religion's vitality in Muslim countries. So we will want to look at several of these points in some more detail. First is the point that Stark makes in response to the claim that, or the belief that secularization is irreversible. An issue Stark has with the secularization thesis is that its proponents seem to think that it is an irreversible phenomenon, but Stark argues that this is undermined by the evidence, notably in the trends and events in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. If indeed secularization is irreversible, then these locations should, as we would expect, be atheist hives. Yet in the case of the Soviet Union, despite many decades of anti-religious and scientific atheist propaganda, religion could not be destroyed and powerfully resurged after the fall of the Soviet state. Another issue that Stark has is that proponents of the secularization thesis tend to focus their discussions mostly on Christendom, but then will then apply their theses globally. They essentially propose that all belief in the supernatural will die out or diminish. Just as belief, for example, in Jesus Christ's resurrection from the dead will diminish or die out, so will belief in Allah, Amaterasu, Vishnu, Krishna, and among many other gods and spiritual figures in world religions. As we shall see, Stark marshals significant evidence that undermines tendencies to universalize secularization to countries beyond the West. Muslim countries, for example, show the opposite trend. It is with the increase of education in some Muslim countries, for example, that we find, contrary to the secularization thesis, an increase rather than a decrease in religiosity. We will return to this point shortly. Looking at the myth of religious decline, since the 18th century, proponents of the secularization thesis have assumed religious adherence has always declined. Proponents will point to the decline of church attendance in much of Europe as evidence of the erosion of faith. But again, Stark objects. First, Stark argues that religious attendance and participation has always been low, even many centuries before the onset of modernization. Second, proponents of the secularization hypothesis mistakenly correlate a lack of church attendance with a lack of religiosity. Stark also argues that this is mistaken. For example, despite small levels of church attendance, levels of subjective religiosity remain very high. Stark applies this to the so-called secular nations where the majority of its inhabitants believe in God, although only a small minority attend church. The question Stark raises here is not why people no longer believe, but why they persist in believing but see no need to participate with even minimal regularity in their religious institutions. We then arrive at Stark's notion of the myth of past piety. There is, in Stark's view, no so-called historical age of faith. Here Stark sees very little change in religion's constitution between the Middle Ages and now. Like then, today most people are religious because they believe, and like today, most did not take their beliefs very seriously. Stark writes that we must keep in mind that a substantial proportion of medieval populations did not take their religious beliefs very seriously, nor must we forget that a significant number, probably about the same today, rejected religious beliefs. Stark cites many sources in support of this claim. For example, according to an 11th century English monk, most people didn't attend church in the mornings, but rather in their bedchambers. The Dominican prior Humbert of Romans talks about how reaching the laity involved catching them at markets and tournaments, in ships, and so on. Humbert went on to say that the masses rarely go to church and rarely attend sermons. The anonymous author of Dives and Pauper complained that the people these days are loath to hear God's service. They come late and leave early, from church that is. They'd rather go to a tavern than to Holy Church. Further, Tuscan peasants seldom attended Mass, and that very many of them do not confess once a year, and far fewer than those who take communion. Further surveys of surviving medieval churches in Europe reveal them to be far too small to have even held more than a tiny fraction of a town's population. Many of these churches did not even have active clergy in them. Many of the people who did go to church did so with reluctance and often out of compulsion. Moreover, when we find occasions of mass religious enthusiasm, such as in the cases of the Waldensians and the Albigensians, This is always in response to already existing religious apathy and alienation. Such enthusiasm would not happen if conventional religion and religious organizations were strong. Moreover, Stark highlights the fact that piety has in fact increased over time rather than decreased. In Britain in the year 1800, for example, only 12% of the population belonged to a specific religious congregation. By 1990, this number was at 17%. Stark also brings light to the fact that French Catholics today participate far more frequently in their religion and rituals than they did 200 years ago. This brings us to Stark's next point, which is the failure to christianize. This is to say that the presence and embrace of the Christian religion in Europe during the medieval era has been significantly exaggerated today. As he writes, quote, "The Christianization of a Norse kingdom, for example, often involved little more than the baptism of the nobility and legal recognition of the ecclesiastical sovereignty of the church." Stark views this exaggerated version of the Christianization of Europe, medieval Europe, as wrong, yet it has still been used to support the secularization of modern European societies. Stark offers several pieces of evidence in support of his claim. In Denmark, for example, which was the so-called first Christian nation, which has largely been credited to the succession of Knut the Great in the year 1016. This date has been taken as the official date of the Christianization of Denmark. However, most historians do not equate this with the Christianization of the Danish population. Rather, Christianity was slow to develop and occurred only gradually. The same happened in Ireland, which followed a similar pattern. In the year 1000, the Icelanders gave in to Norwegian pressure and adopted the law that all people should become Christian, and those who here in the land were yet unbaptized should be baptized. The people may also, the law stated, sacrifice to the old gods in private. Despite paganism being outlawed, many of paganism's features were still embraced by the people, and the country's Christianization never resulted in more than minimal participation in church. In other words, this is evidence that the Christianization of European medieval countries was far slower and was more gradual than has traditionally been believed. Moreover, Stark brings us to the notion of religion in so-called secular countries. Again, Stark argues that the secular countries are in fact religious. This is because there is such a thing as believing without belonging. In other words, many people can still believe in religious concepts, yet not belong to any religious organization or institution. As Stark writes, quote, "Subjective religiousness remains high in the nations most often cited as examples of secularization, places where it is claimed that people have outgrown religion for good." Stark focuses on one example of this. He focuses on Iceland, which has often been claimed to be the first ever fully or nearly fully secularized country. This claim is made in light of the country's empty churches, where only a mere 2% of the population attend weekly. However, Stark cites research produced by through the fieldwork of William Swartos that brings this into question. Swartos discovered high levels of in-the-home religion in Iceland, high rates of baptism, and that nearly all weddings occur in a church. Swartos further noted that, quote, "affirmations of personal immortality are typical," end quote, as evidenced in, for example, newspaper obituaries, usually written by a close friend of the deceased. A 1990 World Values Survey reported that 81% of Icelanders are confident that there is life after death. 88% believe in the human soul, and 40% believe in reincarnation. 82% of Icelanders said that they prayed to God sometimes, and only 1 in 4 did so often. Only 2.4% of Icelanders claim to be convinced atheists. Further, spiritualism is widespread in Iceland, and is also popular among leading intellectuals and academics. Given such data, argues Stark, the notion that Iceland is a secularized nation is strongly contradicted by the facts. Stark then introduces us to the topic of religion and science. As Stark notes, if what secular proponents are claiming is true, then we would expect secularization to show most strongly among scientists. But Stark argues that scientists are about as religious as anyone else, and that the presumed incompatibility between religion and science is a myth. Scientists are not notably irreligious and are as likely to attend church as in the general public. He also notices that there has been no significant change in the religiosity of scientists. In 1914, a study by James Luber found that 41.8% of scientists believed in a God who they can pray to and expect answers from. Luber's study was replicated in 1997 and found that 39.3% still hold to the same view, which is a negligible difference. In 1914, 41.5% of respondents accepted the second option in the survey, which is, quote, "I do not believe in the God defined above," end quote, which suggests that most of these respondents believe in some other concept of God. This number was almost identical in 1997's replication, as 45.3% of scientists selected this option. In other words, such statistics do not gel well with the secularization thesis. Stark highlights Eastern revivals in religion, especially in Eastern European countries where previously there was a strong anti-religious sentiment and propaganda. For example, he refers to the Soviet Union, where there were many decades of anti-religious and scientific atheist propaganda intending to destroy religion. But after the fall of the Soviet state, religion once again resurged powerfully. Other countries like Hungary evidence an increased religiosity. There, those who claim to be professed atheists fall from 14% in 1981 to just 4% in 1991. Moreover, in Hungary, monthly church attendance increased from 16% in 1981 to 25% in 1991. A final point Stark raises is how the secularization thesis is incompatible with what we know about Islam. As he writes, quote, "In extraordinary contradiction to the secularization doctrine, there seems to be a profound compatibility of the Islamic faith and modernization. Several studies from quite different parts of the world suggest that Muslim commitment increases with modernization. We must observe the secular proponents' claim in light of secularization's perceived universal applicability. Stark argues that it's not universally applicable. A study of Muslims in Java, for example, discovered that religious commitment was positively correlated with education and occupational prestige. In other words, persons who attended college and were in high-status jobs were much more likely to pray the required 5 times a day, to give alms, and to fast in accord with orthodox Islamic practice, than were Muslims with little education or in low-status occupations. The implications of these findings implied that Muslim practice would increase as modernization continued to progress. Further, a study of the leading Muslim fundamentalist movement in Pakistan found the leaders to be highly educated or having advanced degrees. The movement's supporters came overwhelmingly from the new middle class. In another study, this time in Turkey, since 1978, there has been a marked increase in the proportion of students at the University of Ankara who hold to Orthodox Islamic beliefs. By 1991, the overwhelming majority of students hold to these views. 36% of students firmly believe there's a heaven and a hell, a number which jumped to 75% in 1991. We now arrive at several further considerations while drawing our conclusions. We must remember that Stark authored and published his article in 1999, but that we have since moved past them by more than 20 years. And of course, a lot can happen in that amount of time. For example, it can be debated whether or not several points he made then are still applicable today. Today, for instance, there does seem to be a disparity between the general public and scientists when it comes to religious belief and religious attendance of institutions. According to the Pew Research Center, scientists are less likely to be religious and to attend religious services than members of the general public. 51% of scientists affirm belief in a higher power, of which 33% believe in a God and 18% believe in a universal spiritual higher power. Roughly 41% of scientists do not believe in God or a higher power. By contrast, 95% of Americans believe in some form of God or higher power. There's clearly a disparity between the religious belief in the general public and in scientists. 48% of scientists say they have no religious affiliation, compared to only 17% in the general public. So it could be argued that Stark might be off in his analysis on the subject of science and religion, especially regarding scientists and the attendance of religious services compared to the general public. This is perhaps due to Stark having less data available at his time of writing than sociologists benefit from today. We have also noted a growing religiously unaffiliated population in the West, namely those who identify as agnostic, atheist, or nothing in particular. One might be interested in applying Stark's notion of subjective religiosity to this unaffiliated demographic. How many of this demographic hold to religious ideas, despite being detached from formal religious institutions? Investigation by the Pew Research Center has been conducted on this question, but there's always more that one could do. There are also areas where Stark seems unquestionably correct, especially in his argument against the universal applicability of secularization. We noted the studies Stark highlighted regarding Islam's incompatibility with the secularization thesis. It is also important to note that the Pew Research Center predicts the continued growth of religions worldwide, especially of the major world religions, with the exception of Buddhism. Further, many new religious movements will continue to emerge and evolve, and there's little reason to suspect that this will cease. All in all, Stark provides an informative and helpful engagement with the topic of secularization and religion. He believes that there is much that can be offered that does not cohere with what proponents of the secularization thesis have been proposing. Clearly, much work, even to this day, is still being done in this contested area, and we should encourage dissenting voices like Stark's to feed into the discussion. Such voices will no doubt continue to enrich the conversation.